Okay, in this section, I want to talk about Schleiermacher. I'm talking about Paul Ricoeur's hermeneutics. And going back to my first lecture, I mentioned that for Ricoeur, hermeneutics is the theory of the operations of the understanding in relation to the interpretation of texts. And I also mentioned that for Ricoeur, the hermeneutic problem is going to come to a kind of a crisis in the opposition, which he says is disastrous in his mind, between understanding and explanation. For Ricoeur, I am now going to go discuss Ricoeur's, what he has to say about Schleiermacher, and why Schleiermacher is important for Ricoeur is that Schleiermacher is really the father or the founder of hermeneutics. Now, before Schleiermacher, anytime you interpret a text, you're engaged in hermeneutics. But hermeneutics as a science begins with Schleiermacher. And the reason Ricoeur says is this. He says hermeneutics was born with the attempt to raise exegesis and philology to the level of a Kunstlehre, that is, a technology which is not restricted to a mere collection of unconnected operations. So it was with Schleiermacher that the different disciplines, and what Ricoeur has in mind are the disciplines or the regions or the areas of, on the one hand, philology, which deals with the interpretation of Greek and Roman literature, basically, on the one hand. So that's classical philology, dealt with Greek and Roman literature. And on the other hand, you had people who were engaged interpreting the Bible, biblical exegesis, the Old Testament and the New Testament. We live in our society, Western culture, was basically for about 1700 years or 1800 years, was a Christian society. And so the exegesis of the Bible was a very important discipline. And so basically what Ricoeur is saying is that before Schleiermacher, there was no general hermeneutics, general set of principles hermeneutic principles that could be applied to any text whatsoever. Rather, what you had is a diversity of texts. You had, on the one hand, people interpreting the Old and New Testament. You had, on the other hand, people interpreting Greek and Roman texts. But they were diverse. I mean, they were not the same. On the one hand, you're applying one set of principles to the Bible, another set of principles to the classical text, and then there's another domain too, which was juridical interpretation of interpreting laws. And Ricoeur doesn't mention that in this essay, but that's another one. So they each had their own particular set of rules that applied to each one individually. So there's no common, set of rules that apply to all. With Schleiermacher, Schleiermacher was the first person to unify all the different types of texts. So he said, no, what we're going to do is we're going to figure out a set of rules of interpretation that can be applied to all the different domains or regions. That's what Ricoeur is talking about when he talks about modern hermeneutics undergoes the movement of deregionalization. And this begins with Schleiermacher. Deregionalization, you're now moving from different regions, different texts, biblical texts, classical texts, to a unified, what Ricoeur calls a Kunstlehre, or a technology or a systematic set of principles that can be applied to all the different texts. Another way he puts it is that with Schleiermacher, for the first time, you have a subordination of the different types of texts to a general set of hermeneutic or interpretative principles. And then he compares this subordination of the different texts, types of being, you say the different types of being of the texts, to a set of principles, you could call them epistemological principles, ways in which we know the texts. He's saying with Schleiermacher, what happens is that the individual texts, types of texts, or you could talk about the ways of being of the text, or the ontological types of texts, is not the primary issue anymore. What's the primary issue is the epistemology, or our set of principles of knowing the text becomes primary. And that set of principles is applied to all the different types of texts. Ricoeur refers to this by analogy to the Copernican Revolution brought about by Copernicus, where before Copernicus, you had the Ptolemaic system where the Earth was at the center. With Copernicus, the centrality of the Earth is subordinated to the Sun. The Sun now becomes the center, and the Earth becomes secondary. The Earth revolves around the Sun. Ricoeur is saying the same thing happens with Schleiermacher. You can think of the different types of texts, which before Schleiermacher were like, the analogy would be they were like the Earth at the center. With Schleiermacher, they become now subordinated to the Sun. In this case, the Sun would be the set of hermeneutic principles that are applied to the text. So now the different types of texts are not primary. They are now secondary to the Sun, which is the set of general principles that are applied to all the texts. And he also compares this. He says, what happened with Schleiermacher is analogous to what happened with the Kantian, referring to Immanuel Kant, revolution in the natural sciences, where Kant subordinated ontology to epistemology, meaning Kant said in order to know what things are in the world, that's ontology, the things that exist, that should be subordinated to the way we know about them, which is epistemology. So, for example, let's talk about cause and effect. Before Kant, it was assumed that cause and effect were ontologically real. That means they really existed in the world. What Kant did is he says, no, cause and effect are imposed by the mind onto the world. And he did the same thing with space and time. So what Ricoeur is saying is that what Schleiermacher accomplished when he subordinated the regions or the disciplines or the areas of philology and biblical exegesis to a general Kunstlehre, or system of interpretative principles, subordinated the different disciplines or regions to a set of rules of interpretation. was a Copernican revolution. Okay, I'm going to stop at this point, and in the next lecture, I will develop more of what Ricoeur says about Schleiermacher, and then we will go on to his discussion of Dilthey. And again, all of this is leading to the point in Ricoeur's essay where he discusses what he calls the aporia, which is the conflict between the unresolvable conflict between understanding and explanation, which for Ricoeur is a disastrous opposition. And what Ricoeur wants to do is to overcome that opposition. So that's where we're kind of heading. But before we get there, we have to talk about Schleiermacher, Dilthey, Heidegger, and Gadamer. Okay, so I will end this video at this point.